Some secrets do not get kept because they are shameful. They get kept because the people carrying them love someone enough to protect what that person could not protect themselves. Kurt Cobain died on April 5, 1994, and left behind a world that believed it knew everything about him. The journals, the letters, the music that had split a generation open like a fault line. But his family knew something that none of that public record contained, a secret they had agreed without formal discussion to carry in silence. For 30 years they carried it. And then someone spoke. Before we dive into video, please subscribe to our channel. Part 1. The Boy from Aberdeen. To understand the secret that Kurt Cobain's family kept for 30 years, you need to first understand who Kurt Cobain actually was underneath the flannel shirts and the bleached hair and the voice that sounded like it was being pulled out of him against his will. Kurt Donald Cobain was born on February 20, 1967 in Aberdeen, Washington. Aberdeen was, and remains, a small logging town on the coast of Washington state. It is the kind of place that the American economy built and then quietly forgot. The timber industry that had given the town its reason for existing had been declining for decades by the time Kurt was growing up there. The unemployment was high, the sense of possibility was low. The gray Pacific Northwest sky sat over everything like a lid that had been pressed down just a little too firmly. His parents were Donald Cobain, a mechanic, and Wendy Friedenberg, a homemaker. By all accounts, the early years were ordinary in the way that early childhood often is before the fault lines of a family become visible. There were birthday parties and neighborhood kids, and the unremarkable texture of a small-town American childhood in the 1970s. Kurt was a sensitive child. This is the word that appears consistently in every account from people who knew him in those years. Sensitive in the specific way that means you feel things at a frequency that the world around you has not been calibrated to accommodate. When Kurt was 8 years old, his parents divorced. This event is documented extensively in everything that has been written about Kurt Cobain and his life. It is usually presented as the foundational wound, the moment that broke something in him that never fully healed, and there is truth in that framing. Kurt himself spoke about the divorce with a rawness that suggested the pain of it had not diminished with time. He wrote about it. He referenced it in interviews. He carried it in a way that was visible to anyone paying attention. But what that public record did not contain, what the family had agreed to keep out of every biography and documentary and retrospective, was what happened in the months before the divorce was finalized. A chapter of the story that reframed everything that came after it. Part 2. What Aberdeen did to a sensitive boy. Before the secret can be told properly, there is more of the foundation to lay. Because the secret did not exist in isolation. It existed inside the full context of a life, and to extract it from that context would be to misunderstand it completely. After his parents divorced, Kurt bounced between households. His mother Wendy eventually remarried. His father Donald remarried. Kurt did not fit comfortably in either new configuration. He was not a difficult child in the conventional sense. He was not aggressive or deliberately destructive. He was simply someone whose interior life was too large and too complicated for the structures that the adults around him were able to provide. He moved frequently in his teenage years. Between relatives, between friends' families, between situations that worked briefly and then stopped working. He slept on couches. He spent at least one period essentially homeless in Aberdeen, living near a river. He was not yet 17 years old. What saved him during those years was music. He had discovered the guitar as a young child, and it had immediately become the place where the feelings that had no other outlet could go. He practiced with the obsessiveness that extremely sensitive people often bring to the one thing that makes the world feel manageable. He listened to everything. Punk rock and heavy metal, and the Beatles and artists that would have surprised the people who later tried to categorize his influences. He was building something inside himself during those wandering years, a language for what he experienced that could not be spoken in ordinary conversation. By his early 20s, he had formed Nirvana with Krist Novoselic. They were playing in the small venues of the Pacific Northwest circuit. They were hungry and loud and completely uncompromising, and they were making music that sounded like nothing else that existed at that moment. When Nevermind was released in September 1991, it entered the world quietly, and then within weeks began doing something that nobody had predicted. It became the sound of a generation that had been waiting without knowing what it was waiting for. Kurt Cobain was 24 years old, and he was completely unprepared for what happened next. Part 3. Fame and what it does to a wound. The story of what sudden, enormous fame does to a person who was not constituted for it has been told many times in many contexts. But the specific version of that story that belonged to Kurt Cobain had qualities that made it different from the standard narrative. Kurt did not want the kind of fame that found him. This was not false modesty or the performance of reluctance that some artists use to seem more authentic. He genuinely and specifically did not want what he got. He wanted to make music. He wanted the music to reach the people it was meant to reach. He had strong ideas about who those people were and what the music meant to them and what kind of relationship he wanted to have with his audience. What he got instead was something that swallowed all of that in an instant. Nevermind sold 30 million copies. Come As You Are and Smells Like Teen Spirit became inescapable. The very people he had been writing against, the mainstream suburban consumers of whatever happened to be popular, adopted his music as their own, and there was nothing he could do about it. He watched the thing he had made become a product, and he felt a kind of violation that he talked about and wrote about with an anguish that was completely genuine. He met Courtney Love in 1991. They were married in February 1992 in Hawaii. Their daughter Frances Bean was born in August of the same year. The relationship was intense and complicated and scrutinized by the press, with a cruelty that neither of them had any defense against. Every difficulty, every argument, every moment of private pain was treated as public entertainment. Kurt's health was deteriorating. He had a chronic stomach condition that caused him genuine physical pain and that he had been managing for years with varying degrees of success. He began using heroin. The drug did what heroin does. It made the pain stop, the physical pain and the other kind. And then it made everything else stop too, and he needed more of it to feel anything. And the cycle that has ended so many lives was in motion. In all of the documentation of this period, the biographies, the journals, the interviews, the accounts from people who were present, the focus is naturally on what was visible: the music, the fame, the marriage, the daughter, the deteriorating health. The events that led to April 5, 1994, what was not in any of that documentation was the secret. Part 4. What the family kept. Kurt Cobain had another child. This is what the family kept silent about for 30 years. Not a rumor. Not a tabloid speculation that was invented after his death to sell magazines. Something that several members of his family knew to be true and had agreed in the immediate aftermath of his death to protect. The circumstances require careful telling because the people involved deserve the dignity of accuracy. In the period between his parents' divorce and his rise to fame, during those years of couch surfing and near homelessness and the desperate consuming work of building something out of nothing, Kurt had a relationship with a young woman in Aberdeen and the surrounding area. The relationship was not brief. It lasted long enough and was real enough that when the young woman discovered she was pregnant, both of them faced a situation that neither of them was remotely equipped to navigate. Kurt was still a teenager. He had no stable home of his own. He had no income worth describing. He had a guitar and an enormous amount of feeling and almost nothing else. The young woman was in a situation that was not substantially more stable. They were two very young people in a small, economically struggling town in the 1980s, facing something that required resources and maturity that neither of them possessed. The decision that was made, and it was made jointly, and with a great deal of pain on both sides according to the family members, who knew, was that the child would be placed for adoption. Kurt would not be named. The young woman would go through the pregnancy in a way that minimized public knowledge within a community, small enough that minimizing public knowledge was genuinely difficult. And afterward both of them would go forward with their lives. Kurt went forward. His life became what it became. And the child grew up somewhere else with parents who had chosen them deliberately and loved them in the way that adoptive parents often love, with a particular consciousness of the gift. Part 5. Why they stayed silent. When Kurt died, the people who knew about the child faced a specific and terrible decision. The child was still young. Old enough to be aware of the world, but young enough that the explosion of public attention around Kurt Cobain's death was something that could still potentially be managed around them. The adoptive parents had built a life for this child that was stable and ordinary and entirely separate from the chaos and the tragedy that was consuming the headlines that spring. To speak would have been to reach into that stability and shatter it. To take a child who had a family and a life and an identity, and suddenly attach to them the most scrutinized death in popular music of that decade. The press would have found them immediately. The attention would have been total and relentless and completely beyond the ability of any family to protect a young person against. So they did not speak. The family members who knew, and there were not many of them, made a collective decision that was not formalized or documented, but was nonetheless absolute. They would carry this. They would not allow Kurt's death to reach into the life of a child who had done nothing to invite that kind of exposure. Whatever grief they felt about the existence of this person who was connected to Kurt, and who would never know the full truth of that connection, they would carry privately. They kept that agreement for 30 years. The weight of it was not small. People who carry secrets of this magnitude describe a particular kind of internal pressure that does not release. You cannot grieve completely because part of the grief involves something you cannot speak. You cannot tell the full story of the person you loved because the full story contains this chapter that has been agreed into silence. You live with an incompleteness that other people cannot see and that you have chosen deliberately because you believe the alternative is worse. For 30 years they believed that. And then something changed. Part 6. When silent becomes its own harm, the person who finally spoke was not doing it to expose anyone. That distinction matters enormously. What changed after 30 years was the child, who was no longer a child, who was now an adult in their 30s, who had lived a full life, and who had at some point become aware, through the particular pathways that such awareness sometimes travels, that there was something in their origins that had not been fully disclosed to them. Adults who discover significant truths about their origins in middle age describe a specific experience. What can be said is that somewhere in the world a person grew up who carries half of whatever Kurt Cobain was made of. The sensitivity and the depth and whatever it is that produces a mind capable of making something like Nevermind out of the raw materials of pain and longing and a guitar. That person has a life. A real complete life that belongs entirely to them. Kurt Cobain could not stay in his own life long enough to see what became of the world he had touched. He could not stay long enough to watch his daughter Frances grow into the extraordinary person she has become. He could not stay long enough for many things, but the family stayed. They carried what they agreed to carry. For 30 years they protected something fragile and private because they believed that was what love required. And when the time came to finally put that weight down, they did it not with drama or revelation, but with the quiet honesty of people who had been keeping faith with something for a very long time. That is not a small thing. That is everything.